All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about one major distinction within Islam, a big disagreement, and a sort of separation into two different camps. We're not going to talk, there are divisions within those two camps. We're really not going to get into that. We're going to try to cover the big division, why it happened, what the differences are that it's resulted in. Okay, so that is, of course, the difference between the disagreement between the Shiites and the Sunnis. So the origin of the separation is that when Muhammad died, there was a crisis of succession, as there often is in these sorts of situations. People didn't know who his successor should be as the leader of Islam, as the caliph. Okay, and there was one basic disagreement. There were lots of details. There were lots of killings, people being murdered, etc. But the basic disagreement was whether succession should be hereditary through Muslim, ultimately through Muhammad's son-in-law, or whether it should be by merit. So we should sort of like let the cream rise to the top. We'll pick a leader by their merit, but not by their heredity from Muhammad. And the Sunnis are the majority in the world now, and they ultimately trace their ancestry back to those who accepted the case for merit. So they did not think that it should go by heredity. And the Shiites disagreed. They're the minority in the world today, 10 to 15% of the total population, Muslim population. And they actually accepted the case for heredity. They thought it should, succession should ultimately go through Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali. So, like I said, that was where the disagreement started. That's not the entirety of the disagreement now, because as these things often go over hundreds, in this case over 1,000 years, you have an initial disagreement that causes a split within the religion. And then as the two sides go their separate ways, more differences develop, just because they're sort of developing independently of each other, right? They're not trying to come to consensus together. It's just naturally going to happen. So we'll talk just on the next slide about some of the other differences that have developed over time. But as a matter of fact, the Shiites are the minority, the Sunnis are the majority. Shiite Islam is more popular proportionally among non-Arabs because they often feel like they are not the center of Islam, and so they're accepting of this sort of this minority view. As it stands, Iran is sort of the center de facto of Shiite Islam now. Although Shiite Islam kind of has its spiritual home in Iraq, but now it just turns out that Iran is sort of the center of it. But even though it originated in a disagreement over heredity, there's been lots of differences that have developed. So one of those is that the two traditions have different interpretations of the Quran. There's lots of different ways that has developed, but that's sort of the main point. As I've mentioned before, there are sources of authority for Muslims independent of the Quran, and one of those is the hadiths, that is the sayings of Muhammad. Right? So you have the Quran, which is a collection of the revelations given to Muhammad, and then there's all of these different hadiths, which are his sayings. But there are disagreements over which ones are actually true sayings of Muhammad, which ones are authoritative, right? And the Shiites and Sunnis disagree about which ones are authoritative for public life and belief. Okay, they have different practices. A lot of these are more minor, but I've picked up a few of the kind of more important ones. As I've said in other videos, the standard Muslim practice is to pray 5 times a day, every day. But some Shiites only pray 3 times a day. They sort of condense it. This is maybe even a more significant divergence of practice. Shiite prayer actually invokes Ali, who was Muhammad's son-in-law, and this is where we have the big split in terms of the heredity versus merit-based cases. But Shiite prayer, because that's the origin of this split, they've sort of focused a lot of their devotion on Ali, and also on his 2 sons, Hussein and Hassan. That, as if you look to the last point, has is a bigger, more significant issue because Sunnis take this to be what Christians and Jews might call idolatry. It's an objectionable worship of human beings, right? As we've talked about, traditionally, at least Sunni Islam, but Islam in general has had a very strong emphasis on monotheism, that God, Allah, and Allah alone is the object of worship. Right? This is part of the origin of why Muslims don't even make images. We don't want to worship any part of creation. We want to worship only the Creator, Allah. Okay, that's the Muslim view. And so you could see why Muslims, Sunni Muslims at least, could start to be very uncomfortable with a tradition in which your prayer actually invokes Ali. If you're more familiar with the disagreement in America between Protestants and Catholics, a similar thing has happened, right? Protestants accuse Catholics of praying to the saints and of praying to Mary, whereas Catholics say they're just asking. It's not a devotion in the way that they're devoted to Jesus or God. They're just asking those saints to pray for them. And so similarly, we have a similar divergence here, a disagreement. Shiites do not take themselves to be worshiping Ali. Sunnis look at that practice and take the Shiites to be sort of venerating or worshiping a human being, a mere human being. So that's the origin of the split between Shiites and Sunnis, and then an explanation of some of the way that their practices have diverged.